Every morning at 5:30 a.m., 72-year-old Ethel Washington would arrive at 20th Century Fox Studios with her cleaning cart, her worn but spotless uniform, and a thermos of coffee that had to last until her shift ended 12 hours later. For 43 years, she had quietly cleaned the same hallways, dressing rooms, and offices where Hollywood's biggest stars prepared for their roles. Most actors barely noticed her. Some were polite enough to nod. A few even learned her name. But in the summer of 1958, one star would change Ethel's life, and Ethel would change hers right back. Marilyn Monroe was having the worst week of her career. Her marriage to Arthur Miller was crumbling, her latest film was over budget and behind schedule, and the studio executives were treating her like a problematic commodity rather than a human being. She had arrived at the studio that Tuesday morning already exhausted from another sleepless night, dreading another day of judgment and criticism. That's when she encountered Ethel Washington in the most unlikely place, crying quietly in a supply closet. "Excuse me, honey," Ethel said, quickly wiping her eyes and standing up from where she'd been sitting on an overturned bucket. "I didn't mean to be in your way." Marilyn stopped in the doorway, struck by something she rarely encountered in Hollywood. Genuine embarrassment from someone who was concerned about inconveniencing her rather than trying to get something from her. "Are you all right?" Marilyn asked, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about her own problems. Ethel looked at this beautiful blonde woman in an expensive dress and perfect makeup, clearly a star, showing what seemed like real concern for a cleaning lady she'd never met before. "Oh, I'm fine, miss. Just having a moment. My granddaughter's been sick, and the doctor bills." Ethel stopped herself. "I'm sorry, you don't need to hear about my troubles." Something about Ethel's dignity in the face of worry, her refusal to burden a stranger with her problems, touched Marilyn deeply. "What's wrong with your granddaughter?" For the next 20 minutes, in that small supply closet surrounded by mops and cleaning supplies, Marilyn Monroe and Ethel Washington had their first real conversation. Ethel talked about her granddaughter Angela's asthma attacks and the expensive medications the family couldn't afford. Marilyn talked about her own childhood illnesses and the fear of not being able to breathe. When Marilyn finally left the closet, she had Ethel's address written on a piece of paper and a new perspective on what real problems looked like. 3 days later, a check for $500 arrived at Ethel's small apartment in Watts with a note, "For Angela's medicine. From someone who understands what it's like to be scared and not able to breathe." Ethel had cleaned enough dressing rooms to recognize Marilyn Monroe's handwriting from autographed photos, but she had never imagined the famous actress would remember their conversation, let alone care enough to help. The next week, when Ethel saw Marilyn on the studio lot, she approached her carefully. "Miss Monroe, I can't thank you enough for your kindness. Angela's breathing so much better with her new medicine." "I'm so glad," Marilyn said, and she meant it. "How is she doing?" What followed was another 20-minute conversation, this time in Marilyn's dressing room, about children, health, family, and the things that really matter in life. "You know," Ethel said as she prepared to return to her work, "you're the first person in 43 years working here who's ever asked me how my family is doing." That comment hit Marilyn like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had been invisibly serving the studio for longer than Marilyn had been alive, and no one had bothered to see her as a person worth knowing. "Ethel," Marilyn said, "would you like to have lunch with me sometime?" Ethel looked shocked. "Miss Monroe, I couldn't. People would talk." "Let them," Marilyn said with the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "I'd like to hear more about Angela, and about you." That lunch, eaten in Marilyn's dressing room the following Tuesday, began a friendship that would last until Marilyn's death 4 years later. But more importantly, it began a relationship that would teach both women lessons they desperately needed to learn. For Marilyn, Ethel represented something she had been searching for her entire adult life, a relationship with someone who had no agenda, who didn't want anything from her except friendship, and who had lived long enough to offer wisdom instead of just admiration. For Ethel, Marilyn's friendship offered something equally valuable: recognition that her life, her experiences, and her wisdom mattered to someone the whole world considered important. Their weekly lunch meetings became a sanctuary for both women. Ethel would arrive at Marilyn's dressing room with updates about her family, stories from her decades at the studio, and a perspective on life that came from raising 7 children while working multiple jobs to support them. Marilyn would share her struggles with fame, her insecurities about her intelligence, and her fears about whether anyone would ever love her for who she was rather than what she represented. "Honey," Ethel told her one afternoon when Marilyn was particularly down about a critical review. "I've been watching people in this business for 43 years. Most of them come and go like weather. But some of them, the special ones, they leave something behind that matters. You're one of the special ones." "How can you tell?" Marilyn asked. "Because you're sitting here eating lunch with an old cleaning lady instead of having your picture taken at some fancy restaurant. That tells me everything I need to know about your heart." Ethel became Marilyn's informal life coach, offering advice that no Hollywood mentor or therapist had ever provided. She taught Marilyn about budgeting money, about finding joy in simple pleasures, and about the importance of having people in your life who knew you before you were famous. "The problem with being a star," Ethel observed, "is that everybody wants to be close to the light, but they don't want to know the person holding it." In return, Marilyn gave Ethel something she had never expected: the experience of having her wisdom valued by someone the world considered more important than she was. When Ethel mentioned that she had always wanted to learn to read better, Marilyn arranged for a private tutor. When Ethel's grandson needed help with college applications, Marilyn personally wrote recommendation letters. When Ethel's old car broke down, Marilyn quietly arranged for repairs without ever expecting recognition or gratitude. But the most significant gift Marilyn gave Ethel was treating her as an equal in a world that had made Ethel invisible for most of her working life. "Miss Monroe treats me like I matter," Ethel told her daughter one evening. "Like what I think is important. Nobody's ever made me feel that way before." Their friendship faced its first major challenge when a gossip columnist spotted them having lunch together and wrote a snide piece about Marilyn Monroe's desperate attempt to seem like a woman of the people by befriending the help. Marilyn was furious about the column, not because it criticized her, but because it dismissed Ethel as the help rather than recognizing her as a person worthy of friendship. "I don't want to cause problems for your career," Ethel said when they met the following week. "Ethel," Marilyn said firmly, "you are not a problem. You are the best thing that has happened to me since I've been in this business. If people can't understand that friendship doesn't recognize social status, that's their limitation, not ours." The friendship deepened during Marilyn's most difficult periods. When her marriage to Arthur Miller finally ended, Ethel was there with practical advice about starting over and emotional support that didn't come with judgment or agenda. "Honey," Ethel said during one of Marilyn's darkest moments, "I've seen a lot of women rebuild their lives from nothing. The secret isn't pretending it doesn't hurt. The secret is knowing that hurt doesn't last forever, but the strength you build getting through it does." When Marilyn was struggling with substance abuse, Ethel was one of the few people who could speak to her honestly about the dangers without making her feel condemned. "I've raised 7 children," Ethel told her. "I know the difference between someone who's sick and someone who's selfish. You're sick, not selfish. But sick people can get better if they want to badly enough." Ethel's approach to Marilyn's problems was refreshingly different from the enablers and critics who surrounded her. She offered practical solutions instead of pity, accountability instead of judgment, and hope instead of despair. The friendship also transformed Ethel's life in unexpected ways. Through Marilyn, she met other actors and industry professionals who began to see her not as invisible service staff, but as a person with interesting opinions and valuable life experience. Gregory Peck, after being introduced to Ethel by Marilyn, would regularly stop to chat with her about her grandchildren and her observations about Hollywood. "That woman," he told Marilyn, "has more wisdom about this business than most of the executives running it." Tony Curtis began asking Ethel's advice about his own family problems after witnessing one of her conversations with Marilyn. "She has a way of cutting through nonsense and getting to what really matters," he explained. But Ethel's influence on Marilyn was the most profound change. Under Ethel's guidance, Marilyn began to develop a sense of perspective about fame that had previously been impossible for her. "Fame is like cleaning supplies," Ethel told her one day. "It's useful for getting certain jobs done, but if you spend all your time thinking about the supplies instead of the work, you never accomplish anything meaningful." Marilyn began volunteering quietly at a local community center, working with elderly residents who reminded her of Ethel. She started a small scholarship fund for working mothers who wanted to return to school, inspired by Ethel's stories about the dreams she had sacrificed to support her family. "Ethel taught me that the point of having a platform isn't to be seen," Marilyn wrote in her private diary. "It's to lift up people who deserve to be seen." The friendship also gave Marilyn a sense of family that had been missing from her life since childhood. She began spending holidays with Ethel's family, becoming particularly close to Angela, the granddaughter whose medical bills had brought them together. Auntie Marilyn, as Angela called her, became a regular presence at family dinners, birthday parties, and school plays. For the first time in her adult life, Marilyn experienced what it felt like to be valued not for her fame, but for her consistency, her care, and her genuine interest in the lives of others. Having Marilyn in our family, Ethel's daughter Martha later recalled, was like having a sister who happened to be famous. She fit in so naturally that we sometimes forgot she was a movie star until photographers would occasionally show up in our neighborhood. The relationship wasn't without its challenges. Some of Ethel's friends and neighbors were suspicious of Marilyn's motives, wondering what a wealthy actress could possibly want from an elderly cleaning lady. "Some people think she's using you for publicity," Martha warned her mother. "Baby," Ethel replied, "I've been around long enough to know the difference between someone who's using me and someone who's loving me. That girl loves me, and I love her back. Everything else is just noise." Ethel's faith in the friendship was vindicated by Marilyn's consistency. Through career highs and personal lows, through media criticism and public scandals, Marilyn never missed their weekly lunches and never treated Ethel any differently regardless of what else was happening in her life. "Real friendship," Ethel observed, "isn't about being there when it's convenient. It's about being there when it's hard." Their last conversation took place just 3 days before Marilyn's death in August 1962. Ethel later recalled that Marilyn seemed unusually reflective that day, talking about gratitude and the people who had made a difference in her life. "Ethel," Marilyn said, "I want you to know that meeting you changed everything for me. You taught me what it means to be seen as a person instead of just a symbol. You gave me the first real friendship I've ever had." "Honey," Ethel replied, "you gave me something just as precious. You made me feel like my life had value beyond just taking care of other people. You made me feel important." When Marilyn Monroe was found dead on August 5, 1962, Ethel Washington was among the first people called by Marilyn's assistant. The news hit Ethel like a physical blow, not because she was losing access to a celebrity, but because she was losing someone who had become like a daughter to her. At Marilyn's funeral, Ethel sat in the front row with the family, wearing the black dress that Marilyn had given her for special occasions. When the service ended, Ethel was one of the last people to leave, standing quietly by the casket for several minutes. "Thank you, baby girl," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." In the weeks following Marilyn's death, Ethel discovered the full extent of what their friendship had meant. Marilyn's will included provisions that would pay for Angela's college education, cover Ethel's healthcare costs for the rest of her life, and provide a small pension that would allow her to retire with dignity. But more importantly, Marilyn had left detailed instructions with her lawyer about maintaining relationships with Ethel's family. Birthday cards continued to arrive for the grandchildren, signed from Auntie Marilyn's estate. College graduation gifts appeared for family members who went on to higher education. Medical bills were quietly paid when family members faced health crises. "She wanted to keep taking care of us even after she was gone," Martha said years later. "That's how much our family meant to her." Ethel continued working at 20th Century Fox until she was 78, but her relationship with the studio was forever changed by her friendship with Marilyn. Other actors began treating her with respect and genuine interest. Studio executives learned her name and asked about her family. Her opinion was sought and valued by people who had previously never noticed her existence. "Marilyn opened doors for me that I didn't even know existed," Ethel said in a 1975 interview for a local newspaper. "She showed everyone that a person's worth isn't determined by their job title or their bank account. She made people see me as a human being." Ethel became something of a legend at the studio, known not just as the woman who had been Marilyn Monroe's friend, but as someone whose wisdom and perspective were valuable in their own right. Young actors would seek her out for advice. Older performers would chat with her about the changes they had witnessed in Hollywood over the decades. Mrs. Washington, as she was now respectfully called by everyone at the studio, had become a bridge between Hollywood's working class and its elite, largely because Marilyn Monroe had demonstrated that such bridges were not only possible but valuable. Ethel Washington passed away in 1984 at the age of 98, surrounded by 3 generations of family members whose lives had been improved by their connection to Marilyn Monroe. At her funeral, several Hollywood veterans spoke about her influence on their industry and their personal lives. "Ethel Washington changed Hollywood," said director George Cukor, who had known both women. "She did it not by demanding respect, but by earning it through her wisdom, her kindness, and her integrity." And she was able to do that because Marilyn Monroe had the wisdom to recognize quality when she saw it, regardless of social status. Today, there is a small plaque in the 20th Century Fox studio commissary that reads, "In memory of Ethel Washington, 1886 to 1984, and Marilyn Monroe, 1926 to 1962, true friendship recognizes no boundaries." The story of Marilyn Monroe and Ethel Washington reminds us that the most meaningful relationships often develop between people who, on the surface, have nothing in common. Their friendship demonstrates that wisdom can be found in unexpected places, that respect is earned through character rather than status, and that genuine human connection transcends all the artificial barriers that society creates. In a world that often values people based on their wealth, their fame, or their position, the friendship between a Hollywood icon and a studio cleaning lady proves that everyone has something valuable to offer and everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued for who they truly are.